So in this video we're going to be looking at how three other things: historical problems, income inequality, and a lack of role for women can all lead to problems for developing countries. So first of all, inequality of wealth and income. As I said in previous videos, generally low-income countries have higher Gini coefficients, generally in that 0.5 to 0.7 range. Inequality exists for a range of reasons. Often there's a more unequal ownership of land, more corruption, so more of the wealth gets tied into your government officials, an absence of democracy, dictatorships, they have closed markets, state and private monopolies, so a lot of the businesses are run by private monopolists who basically own the whole industry and therefore can make really large profits because of licensing and things like that, as well as like the abuse of political, social and economic power. So essentially these low-income countries generally have a big gap between the rich and the poor, and that has a really negative impact on growth, because what essentially happens is, one, the low-income earners have a lack of savings for investment, so that hurts because of the poverty cycle, but low-income earners also generally have a higher propensity to spend. So if the wealth is tied amongst a select few, there's generally lower levels of aggregate demand than there is if the wealth is more evenly distributed amongst people, because the wealthy are more likely to save their money, the low-income earners just don't have enough money to spend, and there would be more aggregate demand and therefore more production if it was more spread more evenly. So income inequality and wealth can have negative impacts for a country's growth and development. Historical problems, so many low-income countries, particularly in Africa, South America and Central Europe, were once colonies of Europe. They were exploited for their cheap labour, and that sucked out a lot of the natural resources from that country, and therefore has left the citizens with worse living standards than before, because they've lost a lot of their natural resources from the past. Also, little value adding went on in these developing countries, meaning they supply these natural resources for very little profits. It wasn't in the developed nation's best interest to try and establish these industries or try and improve the quality of the labour force or anything like that in these developing countries, because they didn't want competition for these products. They just wanted them supplying the raw materials and then doing the value adding themselves. This has led to persistent problems for developing economies because they've never set up the skills or the know-how to try to get from that next level from just having cash crops and relying on other countries buying those crops, as opposed to turning them into more final end products. Also, is there a lack of role for women in a lot of these developing countries? So often women have less access to rights, less access to healthcare, less access to education. Even though the Millennium Development Goals are trying to improve gender equality, it's often conditions are worse for women. So in 2/3 of countries, both boys and girls now receive primary education. However, women still make up 70% of the world's poor. Women possess less than 25% of the roles in federal parliament and are more likely to experience poverty than men. Many women still die in childbirth and find it difficult to get access to credit, so there's often discrimination against women for getting loans, and that makes it hard for them to set up their own businesses, to be entrepreneurial, and to try and generate any income themselves. So women are more likely to suffer from poverty, violence, and often have a lack of human rights, particularly in some developing countries. By increasing participation amongst women, so by encouraging them to join the workforce, rather than discriminating against them, rather than them having to sort of, I won't say waste their day, but limit their day by collecting water and things like that because of a lack of infrastructure, by getting more women involved in the workforce, by boosting female participation, that can then lead to higher incomes, can lead to increased productivity, because they bring new skills to the workforce, and create more taxation revenue for the government, which they then can use to provide infrastructure and things like that. So promoting the role of women within society is one key thing that governments need to do. Next video we'll talk about government policies.